There's a weapon that powerful countries use to get rid of leaders they don't like, leaders from other countries. It's called a coup. It's a French word that means a punch or a blow, because it kind of means coming in and forcibly punching out a government from power. No elections, no process, just power being seized. Just someone being pushed out and someone being put in. Coups happen in so many different ways, but I want to show you how the coup has been used by the United States of America as a tool to get what they want on the world stage. So let me walk you through some of the major US-led coups over the years to show you that while it sometimes seems like we live in a world full of order and rules, the reality is that the most powerful countries will often get their way by whatever means necessary. Okay, so here's how I'm defining the US-led coups that I'm going to put on our list here. Number one, they were successful. There's a lot of failed coup attempts. We're leaving those out. Number two, there must be at least one US government official involved in the coup. And number three, we need concrete evidence that the US was actually involved, not just speculation. While the US has been involved in tons of regime change efforts around the world, we landed on a much shorter list. These are the coups that I think best exemplify how this tool has been used for international power over the years. And they have an election, and this guy, Patrice Lumumba, wins, becomes the prime minister. But immediately, over in Washington, the communist alarm bells instantly start sounding off. Because we're in the middle of the Cold War, and Congo is a place full of tons of natural resources, including loads of uranium, the main ingredient for nuclear bombs. This is at a time when Americans are keeping gas masks next to their bed and have hordes of canned goods in their basements. And officials in Washington can't risk Congo falling into the influence of the Soviet Union. So they start focusing on this prime minister. The CIA director called him, quote, an urgent and prime objective that should, quote, be a high priority of our covert action. So they pull a more political coup than the ones before. They start allying with Lumumba's political enemies and Congo's former colonizer Belgium. They bribe politicians, they fund protests and labor movements, and they circulate propaganda, similar ingredients to the previous coups. And when the moment is right, all these bribed politicians do what the CIA asked them to. They remove Lumumba from power, and the CIA is right there giving money and intelligence and advice to the new government. This political solution was actually not the first try. The CIA had tried to assassinate Lumumba in the past, but all of those attempts failed, which is why they turned to hijacking and manipulating Congolese politics, a brand new democracy, supporting the people who would eventually go on to put Lumumba in front of a Congolese and Belgian firing squad, making this effectively a political assassination, supported from an ocean away.
The Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA for short, has long been invincible to the naked eye, but shrouded in indescribable mystery and controversy. Until recently, coups were seen as internal struggles, manifestations of a people who desire regime change. But to the contrary, they are often planned and legitimized from the outside and then projected as a sign of local instability. They are not sudden sharp actions. In fact, they are built on long-term processes to control geopolitical orders, financial networks, and natural resources. CIA covert operations are by their very nature hard to prove definitively, but research into the agency's work, declassified documents, as well as revelations by former CIA employees have unwound a complicated information web.
To independence now. Tomorrow, the United States of Africa.
As Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana's founding father, as well as Africa's first post-colonial president south of the Sahara, would come to learn, this is the kind of thing one has to plan almost in secret and launch when ready, because as soon as you say it, you'll have a target on your back. From the moment that Nkrumah ascended to power, the CIA's eyes were tracking him and what was happening in Ghana from faraway Langley, Virginia. Nkrumah's ideologies were rooted in his vision of a United States of Africa. He believed that the only way for Africa to truly progress was through the creation of a federal state based on a common market, common currency, a unified army, and a common foreign policy that would enable Africa to solve internal conflicts as well as defend itself against external threats.
So you have two groups that form in the early 1960s around of newly independent countries who were trying to figure out what this new independence means, how they should relate to other former colonies, how to push forward the struggle for decolonization, how African countries should relate to one another. They're trying to figure this out. So you have the Casablanca group. Now the Casablanca group is really the radical group is the way to think about it. That has Kwame Nkrumah in it, Sékou Touré from Guinea, the Algerians, of course, who is a radical country just emerged from armed struggle, Morocco, the king of Morocco at that time, that's why it's called the Casablanca group, and Mali as well was a piece of that. And Egypt, Mr. Nasser was also involved in the Casablanca group. And they were saying, well, there's only really one way for Africa to overcome the legacy of slavery, the legacy of colonialism, which has underdeveloped the continent and held us back for so long. And that's to recognize that the colonial borders are essentially fake, and that they had nothing to do with Africans, and that the easiest way for Africa to grow stronger is for it to grow closer together. Instead of having all of these different separate countries, even if they sort of become independent in that way, they should be looking to get closer and closer, unify their economies, unify their societies, and try to use all of the different strengths of all the different African countries united to lift up the continent. Now, since a huge amount of resources for the Western economy come from Africa, obviously the leverage of Africa on the world stage would be huge. Obviously, the amount of resources in terms of actual wealth they would be bringing in would be significant. So this form of Pan-African unity, which is being heavily pushed, especially by Kwame Nkrumah, who for years had been a part of the broader Pan-African movement that was the centerpiece of the anti-colonial movement prior to World War II, and they had been pushing a similar type of piece. But the US and Europe, but especially the US, does not like this, was very concerned about this. So the United States and France and the United Kingdom were working closely with the more conservative leaders in something that became known as the Monrovia Group. This involves Liberia, this involves Senegal, this involved Cote d'Ivoire, and some of the other countries, and they were basically pushing a different piece. And that reality is, well, we actually shouldn't really unite. We should have good relations. We should, talk to one another. We should come together, but we should have independent states on the basis of colonial borders. We shouldn't really be pushing Pan-Africanism, and we shouldn't really be going out of our way to make any big changes.
The UK and the US began discussions of regime change in Ghana in 1961, a whole 5 years before its actual execution. The coup leaders informed the public of the regime change over the radio at dawn on February 24, 1966. On the ground, senior officials of the Ghana army carried out the coup as the US intelligence agency pulled the strings and called the shots from behind the scenes. Declassified documents later proved that the CIA had orchestrated the plot to get rid of the man who, according to the files, did more to undermine American interests than any other black African.
They were trying to shape the impact of the emerging colonial African states to make sure that they were not truly a counterweight to the imperialist agenda and the neocolonialist agenda, which meant that even though the colonies were gone, the basic role that these countries played in the world economy would remain the same, and that's as essentially resource extraction hubs.
This is why one cannot trust the Western propaganda machine.
The sharing of biased and
false news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media simply aren't true without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think, and this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
They are programmed to narrate a story that upholds the Western economic warfare system, as the West, especially Europe, would crumble without exploiting Africa for its resources. They operate under mandates set by the white power structure to maintain America and NATO countries' economic status and prevent others, especially in Africa and Latin America, from climbing the economic ladder.
Africa, historically, sub-Saharan Africa, has been fundamental to the global prosperity of the advanced countries. Okay? And Africa had a role to play. It has a role as a raw material producer. We will not allow sub-Saharan Africa to escape that. Okay, we do everything to keep sub-Saharan Africa where it is, also impoverished. It's absolutely vital for the prosperity of everyone else. So let's get clear about that. Okay, and this means all the economic structures, all the global institutions, and the economics we teach everyone is all designed to keep Africa exactly where it is. And whether it is Europe or US or now China, it's always the same. We need Africa to be impoverished because we need those raw materials and we need them dirt cheap. Okay, so that's the message.
And I'm going to quote what he has written. Quote, I was particularly struck by a conversation I had with a Greek professor attached to an international agency in Geneva. He told me his opinion of why West Europeans were supporting the rebellion against Nigeria. It was, he said, common among Westerners to sympathize with the underdog in any dispute, which in this case happens to be the Eastern Igbo. But what was even more important to the West was that Nigeria was a potential rival power in Africa, a force which had to be checked before it becomes a threat to Western European interests on the continent. The Biafran challenge, accordingly, provided a suitable opportunity to trim Nigeria's growing wings. He said that according to certain estimates, Nigeria was sitting on a keg of oil, which, given a suitable condition, would make it so rich in just 10 years, that is by 1978, that Nigeria would not require any aid from Europe. Indeed, Nigeria would be in a position to assist other African countries, especially the poorer ones, and thus undermine an important basis on which European influence was exercised over them. I underline that. He did not therefore think that Europe would stand idly by and watch Nigeria become to Africa what the United Nations had become to Western Europe. The rebel enclave, on the other hand, could be encouraged to become a rich but small and manageable African country which would still be dependent on the West, just as some small oil-rich Arab countries have been. Finally, he assured me that whatever happened in the future, the West would never allow Nigeria to develop to a position where its wealth and power would threaten West European interests in Africa.
The ruination of Nigeria was always part and parcel of the seed of its making. Nigeria was always found on multiple lies, and those lies were always going to eventually consume it if we never found the grace to confront those lies with truth. Our situation, we excuse the failings, quote and unquote, of our rulers on incapacity, on mistakes, we find multiple excuses. What we never seem to understand is that they are doing exactly what they set out to do. So how do I tell a man who knew beforehand the exact repercussion of the actions and inactions that he had decided consciously to do, to carry out? It didn't take Tinubu to destroy Nigeria. It took all of us, but Buhari was particularly effective in the ruination of Nigeria. If he had been set the task of destroying Nigeria, he couldn't have done a better job. He weaponized ethnic bigotry, religious bigotry, corruption, but that is not to excuse the failings of Jonathan himself. Jonathan actually prepared the ground for the failure that became Buhari.
We're now in the era of President Tinubu.
The last horseman of the apocalypse. That is what it is.
Are we our own worst enemy? A lot of Africans around the world, particularly here in the United States are beginning to evolve a narrative and a philosophy that is very dangerous, that posits that African people are our own worst enemy. And I want to be very clear. I do not support the narrative that African people are our own worst enemy. We are not our own worst enemy. We are not. We may be the number one accomplice to the enemy. We may be the number one ally to the enemy. We may be our second worst enemy, but we are not our worst enemy.
I was leaving the Pentagon and an officer from the Joint Staff called me into his office. He pulled up a piece of paper off his desk. He said, I just got this memo from the Secretary of Defense's office that says we're going to attack and destroy the governments in 7 countries in 5 years. We're going to start with Iraq, and then we're going to move to Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Iran. They wanted us to destabilize the Middle East, turn it upside down. Now, did anybody ever tell you that? Was there a national dialogue on this? Did senators and congressmen stand up and denounce this plan? Was there a full-fledged American debate on it? Absolutely not. And there still isn't. And I put that aside. It was like a nugget that you hold on to. This country was taken over by a group of people with a policy coup. Wolfowitz and Cheney and Rumsfeld, and you could name a half dozen other collaborators from the Project for a New American Century.
Dick Cheney, the most dangerous vice president in the history of the United States, says, I'm going to vote for Kamala Harris. She issued a statement saying, I'm proud to receive Dick Cheney's endorsement.
A vote is a vote. Just because somebody endorses you doesn't mean that you have to accept an
literally
endorsement.
take an endorsement from Adolf Hitler to win power?
Dick Cheney has just released a formal statement, a public statement, explaining why he's decided to do this, John. Let me read a little bit of that statement. In our nation, this is Dick Cheney, in our nation's 248-year history, there has never been an individual who is a greater threat to our republic than Donald Trump. That is why I will be casting my vote for Vice President Kamala Harris. That's a blistering statement.
Because you got to deal with the World Bank that keeps Africa underdeveloped. You got to deal with the International Monetary Fund that exploits Africa in the name of loans. And you have to deal with AFRICOM, Barack Obama's African Command, that is fueling and funding coups in every African country that is either siding with the Chinese or isn't going along with the agenda of Washington, D.C.
If Africa does do something different, I assure you living standards of all those in Europe and North America and Asia is going to fall. Okay? And that is a big price to pay. I assure you that the West is not going to allow that without a big fight.
African leaders aren't benefited by U.S. military presence. They didn't bring the U.S. military into Africa to protect you. They brought the U.S. military into Africa to overthrow you when you don't do what they want you to do. 90% of the coups in Africa, the overthrow of democratically elected leaders, 90% of the coups in Africa were in countries that have what? Barack Obama AFRICOM bases. Is that a coincidence?
I'm still in court with 6 different U.S. government agencies. So the IRS, the DEA, the FBI, the CIA, the State Department, and the Executive Office of the U.S. Attorneys. And there have been some incredible things that I have witnessed through the course of this FOIA lawsuit, where I've seen the U.S. government telling lies in court. I didn't know such things were possible. It's been a real learning process, and as far as it's possible to tell, it's clear that the U.S. government, even from the wording of some of the privacy exceptions which have been used to prevent the release of this information into the public domain, there have been privacy exceptions that have been linked to national security. Somehow, why and how exactly that is the case, I guess the U.S. government is the only one that can answer that question. So
it doesn't mean to say that there's nothing Africans can do. Of course there is. Okay, but this is the opposition that they're fighting. This is what it's about.
What many don't realize is change is possible. There can be a world where Africa's economic architecture benefits Africans. The Biden-Harris administration is no stranger to imperialism. Just last year, they allied with France to ignite conflict in West Africa, stirring division between ECOWAS and the Sahel region. Though ECOWAS leaders serve as the public face of this divide, there are often economic rewards for betraying their own people. If you're unaware, Francophone Africa has experienced 6 coups since 2020, ousting French puppet presidents and installing military leaders of their choosing. They've now formed the Alliance of the Sahel States and designed a new economic infrastructure, allowing their economies to flourish significantly since France's removal. For instance, the African Development Bank predicts that Niger's GDP will grow by 10.4% in 2024, the highest growth rate in Africa. This growth is expected to be driven by hydrocarbons and the agriculture sector.
Has there been any perhaps influence or inspiration taken in what's been happening in the Sahel over the last year or so, with all these different movements pushing out, and new governments rising, pushing out the French and the Americans, and basically trying to impose their own sovereignty on their countries? And obviously Nigeria has been used by the US to kind of push back against that. But has any of those changes across West Africa influenced people's views about what they're able to perhaps do in their own country of Nigeria?
Absolutely have. So specifically the coup which happened last year in Niger, which is Nigeria's immediate northern neighbor, has had a definite impact, because I think prior to that coup, most Nigerians sort of thought of Niger as this sort of 37th state of Nigeria, not a very significant country in the eyes of most Nigerians. Didn't really understand how it was even a strategically important country in geopolitical terms. And then the coup happened, and the flurry of international attention that came with it, and then more importantly, the fact that afterward, Nigeria has since become Africa's top performing economy in the space of, in a situation where it ordinarily is expected to be in chaos. It's doing 11% economic growth, which that's the sort of economic growth numbers Nigeria hasn't seen since maybe the 1970s during the oil boom.
The irony is that France's economy heavily relies on exploiting Francophone Africa.
Did you know France makes Africa pay for its own foreign aid by manipulating the West African franc? Based on a review of public financial reports, it appears France has never actually used its own money to help Africa. I'm about to discuss one of the most elaborate financial cons since the original Ponzi scheme, and no matter how bad you think this is, don't worry, it gets worse. First, the backstory. France controls the creation of money for 14 countries in Africa, a legacy of colonialism. We call this either the West or Central African franc, depending on the country. Every year, France prints between 20 and 40 billion euros worth of this African currency, which it uses to buy natural resources, influence African leaders, and occasionally provide some developmental aid. Pay attention. France prints the Africans' own paper currency and then exchanges the currency they just printed for physical goods and resources. You might be tempted to call this counterfeiting, but they already have a word for this in French. It's called seigniorage.
The purpose of NATO is to prevent war, is to preserve peace, is to prevent an attack on NATO allies, and we have done so successfully.
When you comprehend NATO's mission, you realize it's not about global peace. Instead, it aims to sustain the white supremacist economic infrastructure established since Europe's transition from the feudal to the industrial era.
French warships arrive in Ivory Coast with French troops. The reason they're giving for being there is that they want to fight illegal fishing, drug trafficking, and piracy. This warship has 300 troops, 60 vehicles, and 2 helicopters. So people are not very happy, especially Africans that are aware of what is going on in the Sahel region are not really happy about this, because you know what's been happening between France and the Sahel region. And on top of that, just last month, Burkina Faso disclosed information, which was huge because the leader of Burkina Faso was accusing France of trying to destabilize their country using Ivory Coast leaders. He specifically said they have nothing against the people, it's not the people, but the leadership. Burkina Faso makes a huge accusation against France, and they claim that they have evidence to prove it. According to reports, Burkina Faso's military leader, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, he has evidence of destabilization orchestrated against his country by France. And he said it is supported by Benin and Ivory Coast. President Traoré said, quote, "We have nothing against the Ivorian people, but we do have something against those who run Ivory Coast." So now that there's information out there that shows us or tells us that France is working with Ivory Coast to allegedly destabilize these countries that are working hard to cut ties with France and just get out of the situation they are in when it comes to neocolonization and this exploitation they've been under. Now Ivory Coast is accepting French warships. It's not looking good.
The Ukraine is trying to mess up the Sahel alliance. You know, the war that is going on between Russia and Ukraine, it has now spilled over into Africa, and it is affecting the Sahel alliance between Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali. Recently, there was an attack, an ambush in Mali, the border between Mali and Algeria, where Tuareg militants ambushed and unalived took the lives of Mali troops and Russian Wagner troops in an ambush. And it has been alleged, and it hasn't been denied, that Ukraine gave intelligence and training and weapons to the militants who made that ambush happen. Based on all the information that I've told you about what has been going on in the Sahel, what has been going on with all these African nations trying to free themselves from neocolonialism, this is a very, very pivotal time. The Ukraine are at war with Russia. Guys, pay attention to what I'm going to tell you. V versus Russia. Now, Russia have been isolated from the Western Hemisphere and NATO, which is what Ukraine wants to be a part of, which is what caused the chaos. Russia, because they've been isolated, started doing partnerships in earnest with these countries, with the Sahel, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, so on and so forth. And those countries have been giving Russia resources and trade in exchange for support militarily, technology, power, infrastructure, and so forth. Okay? The Ukraine's tactic has expanded beyond just the battleground in the east. But they are now attacking and supporting anybody that supports Russia. And where is that happening a lot of? In Mali, Niger, and the Sahel region. So Ukraine are now offering support to anybody who is attacking Russian interests in the Sahel. Guys, are you paying attention to what I'm telling you? It has nothing to do with the fact that France and the UK, well, the UK is a separate thing because they are just really connected to this whole business. But France and the US have lost ground in Mali, Niger, and Chad, and Burkina Faso, and so forth. Because if you remember, General Tiani said, USA, we don't want you in Niger, get out. Mali, we don't want France in Mali, we don't want the USA, get out. And they welcomed Russia into the Sahel via a group that I've told you called Wagner. The Wagner group are a Russian paramilitary group which are not officially part of the Russian government, but everybody knows that they're operating on behalf of the Russian government in Africa. But what it provides them, because they are mercenaries, is plausible deniability. Plausible deniability means that if they do anything messed up in Africa, it is not on the Russian government because they are private. They're not the Russian government. Some people are saying that why don't these African nations invite the official Russian army into Africa? I know the reason why is that then you have less control over the transaction. When it's just a private deal that you're doing with somebody, you can just say, listen, we pay you X, you give us the support that we want you to give us, boom, 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 da, 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 da. The second you bring in an official country's army into your nation, you've got watchdogs, you've got like UN, NATO, all of these guys breathing down your neck, G7, everybody's in your business. You've got to go through parliament, you've got to go through all of these sort of things. You don't want to have to do that. Now, a lot of guys who criticize this will try and say that, Africa, why are you using mercenaries? These people are doing crimes against humanity in Africa, blah, 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 blah. I'm going to put another name on the board. I'm going to put another name on the board. You remember a man called Eric Prince, who said that the West should recolonize Africa.
And if so many of these countries around the world are incapable of governing themselves, then it's time for us to just put the imperial hat back on to say, we're going to govern those countries if you're incapable of governing yourselves, because enough is enough. We're done being invaded.
Because our own national security risk is at stake.
Exactly.
National security interests are at stake.
You can say that about pretty much all of Africa. They're incapable of governing themselves and benefiting their citizens because the governments there are all about looting and pillaging and lining their pockets and going shopping in Paris instead of actually making their country better.
People on the left are going to watch this. They're going to say, wait a minute, Eric Prince is talking about being a colonialist again.
Absolutely. Yes. Enough.
I'm going to put another name on the board. And you guys tell me if you know what this name is. Do you know what that is? Blackwater? Blackwater is an American paramilitary group that is exactly the same as Wagner, but they operate on behalf of the CIA in Africa. And the difference between Blackwater and Wagner is that Blackwater answer to their foreign masters. They don't answer to an African government. African governments do not hire Blackwater in Africa. They are hired by foreign interests because Eric Prince started Blackwater after the Rwanda genocide to protect the interests of foreigners in Africa. The Sahel Alliance is very dangerous to the Western Hemisphere because it is an alternative to ECOWAS, and it is independent. They're not beholden to the US and France and UK and so on. And they're connected to Russia and China. The idea with all of this, in my view, is just to destabilize that region so the Sahel Alliance doesn't function. That is what I believe is going on.
The impact of 9/11 was really just to give the United States a new sort of umbrella reason by which they could insert these military forces all across Africa for geopolitical reasons, not for any real counterterrorism reason, but because people are claiming allegiance to Al-Qaeda, claiming allegiance to the Islamic State now in this day and forth, or forming their own groups that are similar to them, gave them a pretext to say, well, we're going to fight Islamic extremism. But in reality, that's not what they were going to do. It's certainly not what they're accomplishing. And there's all these sort of deeper reasons behind it. But, just like Afghanistan, going after the Taliban was the broader excuse for going into a geostrategically important region. Just like, the United States allying with any particular country is allegedly for something, protecting democracy and freedom versus something else. It's the same thing that we have. We have the same situation here in Africa post 9/11, which is that it's used as a pretext. Terrorism, quote unquote, is used as a pretext, a twofold pretext. One, to use these military forces, but in a way, if we take one step back, more than just the intervention piece, it's also a way to legitimize these neo-colonial governments that lack legitimacy many times with their own countries, and certainly in the eyes of any real observer, lack a lot of legitimacy in terms of what they're really doing. But now they have this new sort of souped up role that I think is very similar to what the US did in the 80s in Latin America, where they backed all these terrible governments that all they wanted to do was take as much wealth as they could that wasn't sent off to Washington and Brussels and oppress the people. Same thing here. But since they had anti-communism then, they now in Africa have anti-terrorism, and it's a very convenient excuse for them to not only control the countries directly, but sort of indirectly give a new backing to these neocolonial governments, that many of which have been under quite a bit of fire over the past decade or so.
Barack Obama is a hero to you ninjas. I remember when Obama was running. I was in Nigeria during the Obama campaign, the first one. I was in South Africa during 2008, the Obama campaign, and Africans in Nigeria, Africans in South Africa swore to me up and down Barack Obama would be a blessing. Even in Africa, we thought Barack Obama would be a blessing.
Black West Africa is not a priority. Very stark, very hard to say, but that's the case right now. Look, what's happening in Nigeria is barbarous. It's horrible. I mean, it's complete madness, yet it's not a priority. It's a regional issue. If we were to see Boko Haram appear in some other region of the world, white Africa, which is North Africa, or in the Mideast in some way, we would be alarmed, but it's a regional issue. It recruits regionally. There's a limitless supply of radicals in that part of the world that are willing to do these incredibly barbarous acts. There's a limitless supply of radicals in that part of the world that are willing to do these incredibly barbarous acts.
When you read what some of these slave owners did, it really does make your stomach heave. Here are 3 accounts of punishments meted out by Thistlewood in 3 months in 1756. Darby catched eating canes, had him well flogged and pickled, then made Hector shit in his mouth. Rubbed Hazat with molasses and exposed him naked to the flies all day and to the mosquitoes all night. Flogged Punch well, and then washed and rubbed in salt pickle, lime juice and bird pepper, made Negro Joe piss in his eyes and mouth. Thistlewood kept a tally of what was known as nutmegging, the rape of female slaves, something he did by his own reckoning on 3,852 occasions. He would allow his guests to do the same.
They used to eat us. They used to use our skin as furniture. They used to use our hair as insulation for their clothes. They used to castrate us in streets for public display in front of their children. They used to essay black men as a form of intimidation to other black men. Look up what buck breaking is. I'm telling you right now, them books in high school that you used to read about slavery do not do it justice. These people were such sick animals to us. It's so crazy how people just gloss over like, oh yeah, slavery happened. What? I really need y'all to see the severity of how bad slavery was.
There's a limitless supply of radicals in that part of the world that are willing to do these incredibly barbarous acts. But if we can contain it, if it can be contained, if it can self-contain, in other words, it doesn't have an ability to metastasize or expand elsewhere, frankly, sadly, we're okay with it. The United States unilaterally could do almost anything it needs to do to root out Boko Haram. It would be a long-term effort, but it could be done. And the United States has the capability. All the elements of power, we have those.
So why not?
Complete, it's not a priority.
Then the other thing that's important to remember about the whole piece, and there's many others, the US base in Djibouti, that's there, but there's also the fact that there don't have to be a US base there to be US forces. And so there's also the embeddedness of US forces with some of these entities as quote unquote trainers. And so they'll be in the country, they'll be based in the country, they'll be doing things in the country, but there may not be like a US base in said country. So I think the footprint in some ways can be a little misleading, because since the footprint is not insignificant, I mean, there's bases in Niger, there's bases in Djibouti, there's bases in Somalia. I believe there's there's a French base in Mali, which I believe the US also operates out of that. So it's not insignificant at all. And at one point there were bases in Libya and different places. I think most of those have been withdrawn, but at one point there were little special forces units there. But nevertheless, I think that can almost be a little bit misleading because of the fact that a lot of times it's just the nature of either the embeddedness or these limited or relatively limited deployments that take place where they're not sort of permanently basing, and it creates the perception that there's less going on. But I think what's important to recognize is that now pretty much all the US troops in Central Europe, so in Italy and Germany, which is a lot of US troops, that's one of the main areas for US troops, are now basically also available for service on the African continent. So we've actually drastically increased the number of troops that are tens of thousands of troops, really some of America's best units and most advanced weaponry, because it's there to quote unquote counter Russia, are now actually able to designed and thinking and planning to force project into Africa.
Brothers and sisters, Africa is kept backwards by the unseen hand of the white man and the yellow man. Make no mistake about it. Make no mistake about it.
Biden is not speaking to any of these issues in a way that would in any way, shape, or form indicate that he is looking for some form of change.
And their major weapon is self-serving, disingenuous African leadership.
You can see again and again that no matter what they say, no matter how many different little things that they put out, that the US's only real goal in Africa is to find leaders that at the end of the day won't change the economic status quo.
We did not create the problem, but we are responsible for the solutions.